Cassian Vale had everything. A skyline apartment that kissed the clouds, a private jet with leather seats softer than most people's beds, and a net worth that climbed like ivy on Wall Street. He had built Vale Dynamics from a dingy garage in San Jose into the kind of empire people wrote TED Talks about. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as a studio audience clapped and laughed on cue, Cassian sat on a late-night couch blinking under the studio lights, utterly adrift. "So Cassian," the host grinned, cards in hand, "you've conquered tech, you've dabbled in space tourism, and now you're launching a climate initiative. What's next?" Cassian smiled on the outside. On the inside, something cold cracked. "Honestly," he said, "I have no idea." A polite ripple of laughter followed. The host leaned in, sensing a soundbite. "No idea? Surely the world's most eligible billionaire has a plan." Cassian scratched the edge of his jaw. The cameras zoomed in. Millions were watching. "I think I've been following the wrong map," he said quietly. The host blinked. The audience blinked. And Cassian Vale, who had never once fumbled a pitch, stood up mid-segment and walked off set. No dramatic exit, no PR spin, just gone. That night, back in his silent penthouse, Cassian opened a drawer in his study, a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small velvet pouch. From it he pulled an old silver compass watch. It had belonged to his grandfather, an Arctic explorer who died before Cassian turned 10. The watch had stopped ticking long ago. The compass needle spun lazily before settling on no direction in particular. His grandfather had once said, "The world will try to sell you a compass. Don't take it. Find your own north." Cassian stared at the watch for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and booked a one-way ticket to Iceland. The terminal was quieter than he expected for a billionaire disappearance. No reporters, no goodbye party. Just Cassian in a worn leather jacket and jeans slipping through a side door at JFK with nothing but a duffel bag and the old silver watch ticking soundlessly in his pocket. He chose Iceland because it was stark, honest, a place with more sheep than people and no one who cared about net worths or press releases. It was, in every way, the opposite of his life. The flight landed in near darkness. It was midwinter. Sunlight only graced the sky for a few hours each day. Snow lashed sideways across the windshield of the rental car as he drove north along a twisting fjord road, barely visible between gusts. The town of Ísafjörður was small and stubborn. Nestled between steep mountains and a frozen sea, it felt like the edge of the world. Cassian booked a room at a local guest house, a place with crooked floors, steaming coffee, and Wi-Fi that wheezed like a pensioner. The innkeeper, Hildur, was in her late 40s with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes that had seen too many winters. She didn't ask questions. She handed him a key and pointed to a kettle. Her teenage son, Arnie, eyed Cassian with suspicion from behind a comic book. Cassian appreciated the silence. The storm rolled in that night. By morning, the roads were buried and the guest house was without power. Cassian woke to the sound of Hildur cursing in Icelandic and the smell of snow through a cracked window. "The generator?" he asked. Hildur nodded grimly. "Frozen. We boil snow, use candles, no big deal." Cassian slipped into his coat and boots. He hadn't touched machinery in years, not since the early days of building circuit boards with his bare hands, but his fingers remembered. Out back, the generator was encased in ice. Cassian chipped, coaxed, rewired. Arnie appeared beside him, watching silently. "You know what you're doing?" Arnie asked. "Kind of," Cassian said. "You don't talk like a tourist." Cassian smiled. "Maybe I'm a different kind of tourist." The generator coughed back to life that evening. Lights flickered on. Hildur brought out a hidden bottle of Brennivin in celebration. Cassian slept that night beneath thick quilts, listening to the wind. For the first time in years, he felt something strange and warm, useful. Over the next few days, he helped fix what he could: a busted snowplow, a school computer with fried circuits. He spent evenings learning Icelandic phrases and listening to Hildur tell stories about the fishing industry collapse. When he learned the local fishery, the village's economic lifeline, was about to shut down, he made a quiet call from the guest house attic using a satellite phone. By morning, a mysterious investment group had offered to back the operation. Arnie grew suspicious. One afternoon, he pulled up Cassian's photo on a cracked tablet and stared. "You're him," he said. "The tech guy, the billionaire." Cassian nodded slowly. "Why are you here?" He looked out the frost-covered window. To remember who I was before everyone started calling me that. Arnie said nothing. Then he grinned. Can I still tell people you helped fix the generator? Cassian laughed. Sure. Just say it was some guy with a broken compass. On his last night in the village, Hildur handed him a small package. Inside was a set of knitted gloves and a note in careful Icelandic. Sometimes the map is wrong, but the road is right. Cassian packed his things. The compass watch, still broken, rested over his heart. As the bus pulled away down the snow-laced road, Arnie gave a single salute from the doorstep. Cassian returned it with a smile. His next stop would be further east. Somewhere higher. Quieter. A monastery, maybe? Or a place with no internet. The world was wide, and for once, he didn't need a map. Just a direction. Just north. The monastery wasn't on any tourist map. It sat high in the Bhutanese Himalayas, draped in clouds and prayers, reachable only by foot after a 6-hour climb through pine forests and mule paths. Cassian Vale arrived with sore legs and a backpack full of blistered intentions. The air smelled of incense and melted snow. Wind chimes whispered across the eaves of ancient rooftops. A handful of monks in red robes and sandals swept the stone steps, humming under their breath. No one asked who he was, which was perfect. A boy, no older than 13, approached and gave a polite bow. Are you here to stay a while? He asked, in English laced with a soft accent. Cassian nodded. If that's all right. We always have space for seekers, the boy said. My name is Tenzin. Come, you will meet the abbot. The abbot was a wiry man with kind eyes and a voice that didn't raise above a whisper. Cassian offered no last name and no history. The abbot asked only one question. Do you know how to sweep? Cassian smiled. Better than I know how to sit still. He was assigned a small room with a straw mat, a wash basin, and a wooden window that opened to a view of endless green valleys. The silence here was different, thicker, sacred, uncurled at the edges. He spent his days sweeping, washing robes, and preparing vegetables with monks who never prodded. Each morning began at sunrise. Bells, chants, tea, stillness. Cassian hated it at first. The itch to check his phone never quite left his fingers. But slowly, the rhythm claimed him. One morning he found Tenzin sitting by the temple's edge, watching a hawk glide below. You've been quiet, Cassian said. And you've been restless, Tenzin replied with a cheeky grin. Cassian laughed, the sound surprising himself. They spoke more after that. Tenzin asked questions Cassian didn't expect, about stars, loneliness, and whether money made people kinder or colder. Cassian gave honest answers. He told Tenzin about the AI project, the one that had revolutionized logistics and eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs. He hadn't foreseen the fallout, or maybe he had, but moved too fast to care. He had built the machine that broke the wheel. Tenzin listened without judgment. Do you think you're a bad person? I think I'm a person who did some good things and some bad ones, and forgot how to tell the difference. Weeks passed. Snow returned to the peaks. Cassian began to sleep better. He noticed details again, the curve of a calligraphy brush, the chirp of sparrows at dawn, the warmth of water on cold hands. One night, Tenzin brought him a surprise, the old silver compass watch. It was rattling in your bag, the boy said. I opened it. I hope that's okay. Cassian blinked. You fixed it? Tenzin shrugged. I made it tick again, but the compass still spins. Cassian held the watch to his ear. Tick, tick, tick. The compass needle trembled, but still danced like it couldn't decide. Maybe that's the point, Tenzin said. Maybe true north isn't a place. Maybe it's a path. That night, Cassian sat beneath a sky dusted with stars. The monastery hummed behind him, a cradle of stillness. He thought about his company, his empire, the headlines he'd once chased. All of it felt like echoes now. He didn't belong here, not forever, but he wasn't ready to go back. In the morning, he left the monastery with a bow and a promise to write. Tenzin gave him a folded slip of paper before he vanished into the misty trail. It read, "The mountain is not the destination, the climb is." Cassian tucked it into his coat alongside the compass watch, which now ticked like a gentle drumbeat against his chest. Next stop, the Amazon. He'd read a story about a woman tracing ancient indigenous maps, something about preserving languages, and something in him stirred. The compass wasn't pointing, but Cassian had learned something better, to follow the pull, not the path. The air was wet with heat, the kind that clung to your skin and soaked into your bones. Cassian stepped off the propeller plane into the pulsing heart of Colombia's Amazonia. The jungle rising like a green wall around the dirt airstrip. Mosquitoes swarmed. Birds screeched, and overhead the sky brooded with the threat of rain. A jeep bounced into view, dust clouding behind it. At the wheel was a woman in mirrored sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, looking like she belonged to the jungle more than to any city. "You Vale?" she shouted over the engine. "Cassian," he said, slinging his pack over one shoulder. "Camila," she replied. "Get in. We've got a long way to go." Camila Restrepo was a cartographer, anthropologist, and, according to the article Cassian had read, a fierce advocate for protecting indigenous lands through ancestral mapping. She was working with a small group of elders to document oral histories, trace forgotten borders, and mark sacred sites before the land could be stolen or paved. She didn't care who Cassian was. She'd only agreed to let him come because he offered to carry equipment and keep quiet. They drove for hours, then hiked the rest. Along the way, Camila explained the stakes. "Maps are power," she said. "Who draws them decides what matters." Cassian nodded, sweating under his pack. "And you want to redraw them?" "No," she said. "I want to restore the ones that were erased." The village they reached had no name on modern maps. It sat near a river that slithered like a snake through the rainforest, and was home to fewer than 200 people. The air smelled of smoke and mangoes. Children peeked from behind trees. A few elders nodded in recognition as Camila approached. Cassian kept his distance, unsure of his place. That night, they sat around a fire as a shaman recited a story in a language that danced like wind through leaves. Camila translated in pieces, sketching symbols in her notebook. "He's talking about a map carved in bark," she whispered. "It showed the paths of jaguars, where the rivers shifted, where the stars told stories." Cassian listened, struck by how language and land were woven like threads in a single tapestry. Back in Silicon Valley, maps were data. Here, they were memory. Days blurred into weeks. Cassian carried gear, filtered water, and took meticulous notes. He began to hear rhythms in the jungle, the lull of frogs, the chatter of monkeys, the hum of unseen life. Camila warmed to him. She caught him fixing a broken solar panel one afternoon and raised an eyebrow. "You're handier than you look." "I used to build things," Cassian said. "What happened?" "I started building things that built things. Then I stopped touching anything at all." Camila didn't press, but her silence made space for honesty. One day, an elder brought them a folded piece of tree bark, etched with a fading map. It marked a sacred hill now slated for commercial development, an airstrip funded by foreign investors. Camila's hands trembled. "They'll destroy it. The burial grounds, the stories, everything." Cassian made a quiet call from the edge of the jungle that night. He didn't say much, just a few names, a few numbers. The next day, the company funding the airstrip mysteriously pulled out. Camila didn't ask questions, she just gave him a long look. "You've done this before, haven't you? Saved things with a phone call." "Sometimes," he said. "But sometimes it's too late." As the project wrapped up, Camila handed Cassian a gift. It was a copy of the bark map, redrawn carefully in ink and sealed in a bamboo case. "To remember what the world looked like before we put our names all over it," she said. Cassian tucked it into his pack, next to the compass watch, which still ticked but hadn't pointed true since Bhutan. He left quietly, as he always did. No speeches, no farewells, just a note pinned to Camila's field tent. "The map is never finished. Keep drawing." Next stop, the river deltas of Bangladesh. He had read about a floating clinic, a boat hospital traveling to places where roads couldn't reach. And something in him whispered, "Go there." The river was a mirror of the sky, mud-brown and wide, flowing with the silent weight of centuries. Cassian stood at the dock, staring at the floating clinic as it rocked gently beside a rickety bamboo walkway. It didn't look like much, more like a houseboat that had seen better decades, but he had learned not to judge appearances. A woman in a faded lab coat waved from the deck. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, her sleeves rolled up, and her face, though lined with exhaustion, carried the kind of determination that didn't wear out. "You the American?" she called out. "Close enough," Cassian replied. "I'm Dr. Noor. You carry boxes and take orders. You stay. You get in the way. I throw you overboard." Cassian smiled. "Fair terms." The Mercy Boat, as it was nicknamed, was part clinic, part pharmacy, and part miracle. It moved through the Sundarbans, a region of tangled delta and mangrove forest where roads vanished and villages floated on the tides. Cassian was immediately put to work, unloading medical crates, boiling water, hauling ropes. There was no room for standing still. Noor didn't believe in small talk, only results. On the second day, Cassian helped set up a vaccination station in a riverside village. He watched Noor move like a storm, treating infections, delivering a baby, scolding a man for not taking his antibiotics. "You always this relentless?" he asked during a lull. "I rest when I'm dead," she said, and then offered him a samosa. There was no fanfare here, no Wi-Fi. No one cared that he had once owned fleets of private jets. Here, he was the guy who boiled gauze and held crying children still for injections. And strangely, it felt more honest than most of his previous life. One evening, as the sun melted into the river, Noor joined him at the bow with a dented kettle of chai. "You're not a doctor, not a volunteer, you're not even a journalist, so what are you?" she asked. Cassian looked out at the water. "A repairman for broken things." "Are you broken?" He didn't answer right away. "I was. Maybe still am." They visited 5 more villages that week. In one, Cassian helped build a bamboo ramp for a boy with a mangled leg. In another, he fixed the solar panel that powered a refrigeration unit holding insulin. But the further they traveled, the more Noor confided in him. The boat was on its last legs. Supplies were dwindling. A new government regulation threatened their permits. Cassian made another call. By the next tide, a shipment arrived from an unknown donor. Medicine, spare parts, fuel. Noor didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and handed him a wrench. "You're useful. That's all I care about." One morning, they awoke to find the river rising faster than expected. A storm was pushing in. They scrambled to move the clinic. As Cassian wrestled with a mooring line, a child screamed. He turned to see the boy slipping into the current. Without thinking, Cassian dove in. The water was colder than he expected, thick with mud and debris. He reached the boy just as the current pulled them toward a snarl of branches. He wrapped his arm around the child and kicked hard. It took both of them to get back. Dripping, coughing, shaking, but alive. Noor stared at him from the deck. "You could have drowned, but I didn't." "Stupid, brave, useful," she muttered. "You might actually be one of us." That night, wrapped in a dry blanket and sipping hot chai, Cassian looked at the stars. The compass watch was ticking faintly under his shirt, still spinning, still unsure. He pulled it out and set it on the deck. Noor sat beside him, wiping her glasses. "What's that?" "An old lie," he said, trying to become something honest. She gave him a look. "You're not bad at honest." He left the next morning, catching a small ferry out of the delta. Noor handed him a torn page from her journal, a list of villages, coordinates, and patient notes. Places that still need help if you're really in the business of repair. Cassian folded it and slipped it next to the map from Camila and the note from Tenzin. The boat drifted into the mist as he looked ahead. Next stop. The Sahara. The desert. The silence. The place where satellites saw everything, but no one listened to the wind. The plane touched down in Arachidia, and the dry heat met Cassian like a slap. Gone was the lushness of the delta. Here, everything was bone and sand, colorless and still. The sun hung like an ancient eye, unblinking. A guide named Idris picked him up in a dented Land Cruiser with no air conditioning and a cassette player that only played old Berber music. Idris was in his 60s with a wind-creased face and teeth stained from mint tea. "You are not here for a spa," Idris said, not unkindly. "Why does a man like you come here?" "I don't know yet," Cassian said. "Maybe to hear what silence sounds like." They drove for hours into the desert, the road giving way to cracked earth and then to no road at all. Finally, they reached a nomadic camp near the Erg Chebi dunes. The tents were made of woven goat hair. The camels snorted with boredom. The air shimmered. Cassian was introduced to the leader, Amara, a woman in her 40s with a presence that seemed to weigh more than her slight frame. She studied him with flinty eyes. "You're not a reporter," she said. "You don't smell like one, and you're too quiet to be a politician." "I'm just listening," he said. "Then you're welcome, for now." He spent the days walking with the tribe, learning the pace of desert life. Time stretched differently here. There were no clocks, just shadows and sun. Meals were simple: flatbread, dates, goat stew. Nights brought stars so thick they looked painted on. One evening, he sat with Amara beside the fire. We are invisible to your satellites, she said. Yet somehow they block our path. Cassian frowned. What do you mean? Our old migration route, it's broken now. Your tech tracks us. Governments watch us, but no one asks why we move. They say we trespass on land that was always ours. Cassian's mind reeled. He had helped fund one of the very satellite networks used by border patrols across northern Africa. Amara tossed a pebble into the fire. We were nomads before your countries were ideas. Now we have to explain our existence. Cassian spent the night under the stars, unable to sleep. He stared at the compass watch. It ticked slowly, the needle spinning with quiet anxiety. He opened his phone and checked the satellite registry. His name was still on several patents. At sunrise, he sent a series of encrypted messages. By midday, one of the largest surveillance arrays in the region had gone offline for maintenance. A week later, it would be sold to an African environmental group instead of military contractors. Amara didn't thank him, but she handed him a scarf and said, "You may not belong here, but you did no harm. That matters." Idris drove him out 3 days later. As they crested a ridge, the entire camp seemed to vanish behind them, swallowed by the dunes. "I hear you changed something," Idris said. Cassian shrugged. "I hope I didn't break it more." "Sometimes," Idris said, "to unmake a cage, you must take apart the lock, quietly." At the airport, Cassian looked again at the compass watch. It was pointing somewhere, just barely. North-northwest. His next destination was uncertain, but something tugged at him, a whisper about a village in Kenya and a well that hadn't run in years. A place where silence meant thirst, and where maybe, just maybe, water could teach him what money never did. The flight into Nairobi was smooth, too smooth. The kind of calm that came before something real, dusty roads, cracked boots, sweat, and sunlight so sharp it cut. Cassian didn't linger in the city. Within a day, he was headed south toward the Rift Valley in a rattling truck with peeling paint and a young driver named Elijah who hummed gospel songs between potholes. "You really want to go to Kijiji ya Tumaini?" Elijah asked. "There's nothing there, just goats, dust, and a memory of water." "That's what I'm looking for," Cassian said. Kijiji ya Tumaini, Village of Hope. The irony hit Cassian like heat off the red clay road. It hadn't rained in months. The well, once the heart of the village, had dried to a cracked hole lined with broken stones. Women walked for miles to fetch brackish water. Children coughed. The goats were skinny. The village elder, Mama Ruth, met Cassian under a thorn tree. Her skin was leathered by sun and years, her voice raspy and kind. "You are not the first outsider to come with big promises," she said. "Most leave when the wind changes." "I didn't come with promises," Cassian replied. "Just hands." She nodded slowly. "Then start digging." And he did. With blistered palms and aching knees, Cassian joined the crew each day to clear the well. They hauled out silt, replaced crumbling stones, tested old pipes. A local engineer, Daniel, joined them. Young, whip-smart, skeptical. "You're too clean to be doing this," Daniel said. "What's your real story?" Cassian grinned. "Just a man looking for water." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're more than that, but all right, let's find it." Days turned into a week. Still no water. Tensions rose. Mama Ruth's hope faded into silence. The villagers watched them from doorways, eyes dimming. One night, Daniel and Cassian sat by a cooking fire, eating maize and beans. "What if there's nothing left?" Daniel asked. "Then we try somewhere else," Cassian said. "Or we build a new kind of well." Daniel shook his head. "You sound like someone who doesn't know what failure is." Cassian stared into the fire. "I know it. I just stopped letting it be the last line." The next morning they dug deeper, and then it happened. A soft hiss, then a bubbling groan. Water, clear, cold, alive. The village erupted. Children screamed and danced. Women wept. Mama Ruth fell to her knees. Cassian sat in the dust, drenched and laughing, the water soaking his clothes like baptism. That evening they celebrated. Cassian helped cook, served food, sat beneath a sky full of burning stars. Mama Ruth pulled him aside. "You did more than fix a well," she said. "You reminded them they matter." He looked at the watch. The compass needle had stopped spinning. It pointed steadily. True north. He smiled. Cassian left the village quietly, leaving behind tools, a maintenance fund, and a note sealed in wax. Hope is not a place, it's a path. He had one last stop. Home. Not the penthouse. Not the boardroom. But a quiet place, where stories end and new ones begin, and where maybe, just maybe, he could finally stop traveling and start arriving. It was a modest cabin at the edge of a lake in Nova Scotia, 2 hours from the nearest airport, a mile from the nearest paved road. The kind of place where winter came early and the stars showed up on time. Cassian unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like cedar and dust and stillness. No staff, no service. Just wood, wind, and water. It had belonged to his grandfather, the man with the compass, and had sat untouched for decades, passed through the family without ceremony. He unpacked slowly. No suitcase, just the duffel he'd carried for months. In it, the tools of a different kind of life. The bark map from Camila, the list from Noor, the slip of paper from Tenzin. And of course, the compass watch. Still ticking. Still true. He placed it on the windowsill beside a chipped photo of his grandfather in Arctic gear, grinning like the world was a playground. "I made it back," Cassian whispered. Days passed quietly. He chopped wood, cooked on a fire, repaired the dock, watched loons skim the lake. At night, he wrote letters. Not emails. Letters. One to Hildur and Arnie in Iceland, one to Tenzin and the abbot in Bhutan, one to Camila, one to Noor, one to Mama Ruth and Daniel. He sent each with a story and a question. "What have you fixed since I left?" In the evenings, he sat on the porch and listened. Not for news or signals or alerts, just for birds, for wind, for nothing at all. And slowly something strange happened. He stopped feeling like a visitor. A neighbor stopped by one day, a grizzled man named Silas with a fishing rod and no concept of personal space. He didn't recognize Cassian, which Cassian appreciated. They fished in silence, drank coffee on the shore, spoke in brief, meaningful phrases. "You staying long?" Silas asked. Cassian thought about it. "I might." Silas nodded. "Good. The loons get lonely." Weeks passed. Winter whispered through the trees. One morning, Cassian woke to frost tracing the windows. He stepped outside with the compass watch in his hand. It pointed forward. He didn't need to know where it was pointing. That wasn't the point anymore. He was no longer looking for north. He was living it. In a small wooden box by the fireplace, he placed everything he'd carried. The map, the notes, the list. Beside them, he left a fresh page with a few words. "If you find your true north, walk with it. And when you can, share it." Cassian Vale sat by the fire, a man who had once owned the sky, now content with a window. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lost. He felt home.